Venezuela moves to confront USS Ronald Reagan Bay. The U.S. response changes everything.
At 5:42 a.m., radar screens aboard USS Ronald Reagan update without warning. 5 new contacts appear at the edge of the display. No AIS, no lights, low shapes moving fast over calm Caribbean water. All 5 are closing from the southwest. Visibility is clear to the horizon, leaving no doubt about their direction. On the bridge, voices stay calm. Tracks are logged. Course and speed remain unchanged. The contacts separate, then slide back together, tightening their spacing. Speed rises past 20 knots. Bearings compress. This is not random traffic. It is a deliberate approach. In the Combat Information Center, the contacts are numbered, not named. Sierra 1 through Sierra 5. Optics confirm Venezuelan naval vessels, older ships, lightly built but moving in coordination. A radio hail goes out, professional and measured, English first, then Spanish. There is no reply. The silence is recorded. On the flight deck, activity pauses. An elevator stops between levels. Sailors freeze where they stand. Nothing looks chaotic. Everything looks controlled. As the distance drops under 8 nautical miles, the carrier's 5-inch gun mount shifts slightly. Not a lock, not a threat. Just awareness. One Venezuelan ship edges ahead and angles toward the carrier's path, a move meant to force a reaction. The carrier does not turn. Another hail goes unanswered. This is not an error, it is a test. And in these first minutes, only one side refuses to blink. If you want to follow what happens next, stay with us. What happened here matters far beyond Venezuela. This is not just about one country refusing pressure. This is about how power is tested and what happens when it no longer works the way it used to. For decades, the United States relied on a simple rule. If a government did not comply, it would be isolated, cut off from banks, cut off from trade, cut off from the global system. The expectation was always the same. Economic pain would turn into political collapse. Leaders would fall. Control would return. That rule worked many times before. But Venezuela broke the pattern. This was not a random target. Venezuela sits on massive energy resources. Its location matters. Its survival sends a signal. If pressure fails here, others will notice. And they already are. This is why Washington paid such close attention. Because sanctions are not just punishment. They are a warning. They tell every other country what happens if you step out of line. When that warning loses force, the entire system weakens. For people inside Venezuela, this was never abstract. This was not about speeches or slogans. This was about empty shelves, power cuts, delayed shipments, and daily uncertainty. But it was also about endurance, about learning to operate under constant stress without giving in. That is the danger Washington sees. Not strength, but survival. Not victory, but refusal. Because once a country proves it can endure pressure and remain standing, the fear factor starts to fade. And when fear fades, control follows. If you believe the United States can still force compliance in the end, press 1. If you think this resistance changes the global balance, press 9. And subscribe to stay with us as this confrontation moves forward. The first response did not come with speeches or public statements. It came quietly, through screens, signals, and small movements that most people would never see. Inside monitoring rooms, the data flow was constant. Financial activity was tracked minute by minute. Trade movements were watched closely. When numbers failed to drop the way they were supposed to, attention sharpened. Something had changed. On one screen, a transaction route shifted. On another, a payment cleared through an unexpected channel. To most people, it looked normal. To analysts, it wasn't. It meant the pressure was being absorbed instead of transferred. That was the first warning. Phones rang. Short calls, no panic. Just urgency. The question was simple. How is this still working? The response was to tighten control. Restrictions were reinforced. Oversight increased. Every move was measured. Every option reviewed. This was still supposed to be a system that leaves no room to breathe. But breathing continued. On the ground, Venezuelan operators adjusted routines. Imports came slower, routes changed. Payments took longer, but they did not stop. People learned how to function inside the gaps. Not comfortably, not safely, but effectively enough. This was not defiance in public. It was adaptation in silence. In Washington, the realization settled in slowly. The tools were still powerful. The pressure was still real. But the outcome was no longer guaranteed. The model assumed collapse would come quickly. It did not plan for endurance. That is when concern replaced confidence. Because when the first response fails to produce results, escalation becomes the only option left, and escalation always carries risk. If you think this first response showed control slipping, press 1. If you think the United States still holds the upper hand, press 9. And subscribe, because what follows is where pressure turns into confrontation. And behind closed doors, one uncomfortable question began to surface. What if this was no longer about forcing a result, but about preventing others from copying it? Because once a single case proves pressure can be survived, the real threat is not failure. It is repetition. When pressure does not work the first time, it never stays the same. It escalates. Inside Washington, the response was not loud, but it was firm. Oversight tightened again. Financial checks multiplied. Secondary pressure expanded. The goal was no longer speed, it was endurance. If collapse would not come quickly, it would be forced slowly. Every channel was reviewed, every partner was warned. The message was clear: doing business with Venezuela would carry consequences. Quiet calls were made, quiet threats followed. This was how escalation looked in real life. No headlines, no announcements, just doors closing one by one. But escalation works both ways. In Venezuela, systems bent under the weight, but they did not snap. Routes were rerouted, payments delayed, then rerouted again. What could not move one way moved another. Nothing was smooth, nothing was efficient, but enough kept flowing to survive. This was not strength, this was strain management. Inside monitoring centers, analysts watched the pattern repeat. Pressure increased, output dipped, then it stabilized. That was the problem. In economic warfare, stability under stress is the warning sign. It means the target has learned how to absorb damage. Fatigue started to show, not on the streets, but inside decision rooms. The same tools were being used again and again, with smaller returns each time. Escalation was costing more and delivering less. And there was another risk. Every added layer of pressure increased the chance of spillover. Allies felt it. Markets reacted. Companies hesitated. The system designed to isolate one country was beginning to strain the wider network. This was no longer a clean operation. It was friction building inside the machine itself. If you think this escalation strengthens United States control, press 1. If you think it is pushing Venezuela to adapt even faster, press 9. And subscribe, because the next phase brings an unexpected turn. And quietly, another realization took shape. Escalation was no longer just about Venezuela. It was becoming a test of credibility. If pressure kept rising without results, it would signal limits that were never meant to be visible. Once those limits are seen, they cannot be unseen. That was the risk now taking form. The real twist did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It appeared quietly, almost invisibly, and that is what made it dangerous. What Washington expected was collapse. What it got was adjustment. Venezuela did not suddenly recover. Its economy did not rebound. Life did not become easier. But something critical happened. The country stopped moving in straight lines. When one route closed, another opened. When one channel was blocked, a slower one appeared. The system learned how to survive inside restrictions. This was never supposed to happen. Sanctions were built on a core assumption: that there was no alternative path, that isolation meant paralysis. But now, small workarounds were connecting into a larger pattern. Trade did not vanish. It rerouted. Payments did not disappear. They changed form. The flow weakened, but it did not stop. Inside Washington, this was the moment of concern, because the goal was never just to hurt Venezuela. The goal was to show everyone else what happens when you refuse. And now the message was becoming unclear. The pressure was still real. The cost was still high, but the outcome was no longer certain, and uncertainty is poison to deterrence. What made this turn even more troubling was that it was being watched, quietly, closely. Other governments were paying attention, not to speeches, but to results, not to intent, but to survival. Because if one country can absorb pressure and remain standing, then the risk is not defiance. The risk is imitation. If you think this adaptation proves the strategy is failing, press 1. If you think pressure will still force a break later, press 9. And subscribe, because the confrontation is about to reach its most dangerous point. And at that point, the question was no longer whether Venezuela could endure. It was whether the system built to enforce obedience could afford to show hesitation. Because hesitation, once exposed, spreads faster than pressure ever could. This is where the confrontation reached its peak. Not with explosions, not with troops, but with a moment of quiet clarity. Inside Washington, the reality became impossible to ignore. The pressure was still intense, the tools were still powerful, but the outcome was no longer predictable. The system had been pushed to a point where adding more force no longer guaranteed control. Short updates moved across desks. Pressure maintained. No collapse. Each line was calm. Together, they told a different story. In Venezuela, there was no celebration, no victory moment. Life remained hard, supplies were limited, costs were high, but the country was still functioning. Barely, but enough. And in strategic terms, enough is everything. This was the breaking point of the assumption. The belief that pressure always leads to obedience. The belief that endurance has limits that can be scheduled. Those beliefs were now under strain. Silence filled decision rooms. Not because nothing was happening, but because everyone understood what this meant. Escalating further carried risks beyond the target. Pulling back carried risks to credibility. Every option now came with consequences. This was no longer about forcing Venezuela to bend. It was about whether the United States could accept a visible challenge to its most reliable tool. Economic pressure only works if everyone believes it is unavoidable. Once doubt appears, the leverage weakens. And doubt was now present. The confrontation did not end here. But it changed shape. From certainty to calculation, from control to management, from command to caution. If you believe the United States will push harder to reassert dominance, press 1. If you think this moment marks a lasting shift in global power, press 9. And subscribe, because the aftermath of this climax will ripple far beyond Venezuela. And beyond the rooms where decisions were made, the impact was already spreading. Markets reacted cautiously. Partners asked quiet questions. Allies watched closely, not for statements, but for signs of hesitation. The confrontation had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a closed case between two sides. It had become a reference point, a moment others would study, measure, and remember. Because once a system shows strain under pressure, every future test becomes harder to control. When the pressure phase ended, the result was not victory or defeat. It was something more unsettling. Venezuela was still there. The country was damaged. Its economy was strained. Daily life remained difficult, but the government had not collapsed. The system had not broken, and that outcome alone carried weight far beyond its borders. Inside Washington, the assessment shifted. This was no longer about one target, it was about precedent. Because power does not rely only on force, it relies on belief. The belief that resistance is pointless. The belief that pressure is final. That belief had taken a visible hit. Around the world, others were watching closely. Not through headlines, but through data. Through trade patterns, through financial adjustments, through quiet diplomatic signals. If Venezuela could endure years of isolation and still function, even barely, then the rules were no longer absolute. This is how influence erodes, not through collapse, but through examples. Markets adjusted, partners reconsidered risk. Smaller nations began asking new questions, not how to avoid pressure, but how to survive it. That shift matters, because once survival becomes imaginable, obedience stops being automatic. The United States remains powerful. Its economy is vast. Its reach is global. That has not changed. What has changed is the assumption that pressure always delivers control. The Venezuela case introduced friction into that equation, and friction spreads. This was not the end of confrontation. It was the beginning of a different phase, one where power must be negotiated more carefully, where pressure must be calculated, not assumed, where every move is watched not just for impact, but for limits. Venezuela did not defeat the system, but it showed the system could be endured, and that may be the most disruptive outcome of all. Because once that lesson is learned, it does not stay in one place.